My name is Abigail Brundin. I am the director here at the British School at Rome. So tonight we're going to be hearing something about the work that has been taking place in Rome as a result of Emma's time here, in an ongoing collaboration that's been happening over the last weeks and months between our two protagonists for this evening, Emma Talbot and Valentino Nizzo. And I will tell you a little bit more about our speakers in a moment. I just wanted to say a few words first about tonight's event. So we're going to be staging for you tonight an interdisciplinary conversation. This is exactly the right venue for an interdisciplinary conversation because the BSR is all about interdisciplinarity. We work across and between disciplines. We have makers and artists here and also researchers and writers working side by side, working together, interacting, collaborating, and thinking together about their creative endeavors. So I hope tonight's conversation will in some way kind of bring alive how productive those kinds of collaborations across disciplines are and can be when these forces meet and spark new ways of looking at things. And it's a particularly rare privilege, I think, to see that being enacted, and that's really what we're going to be doing tonight. The other thing we're going to be doing tonight, which is slightly experimental, is a translingual conversation, because our two speakers are going to speak in their mother tongues, where they are most comfortable, and then I'm going to sort of mediate linguistically, so I will be translating Valentino's contributions into English for you, so that everything is presented in English, but one part is also presented in Italian. And this also seems a very appropriate way to proceed at the British School at Rome. Here we are in a UK funded research institute, but we are in the heart of Italy. So we should be working with both these beautiful languages, and we're going to attempt that tonight. So rich collaborations, traversing languages, traversing cultures, and bringing new fruits to bear from those cultural encounters. Let me introduce our speakers. So Emma Talbot studied at the Birmingham Institute of Art and Design and at the Royal College of Art. She was also a Rome scholar here at the BSR in 1996. So maybe it was a bit colder in those days, or and we were remembering the communal bathrooms, which are no more. Emma is based in London. Her work is included in collections in the UK and the Netherlands, in Australia and Germany, and she's represented by Galeria Onrust in Amsterdam and Petra Rink Gallery in Dusseldorf. Emma has a wide portfolio of teaching at many UK institutions, including Goldsmiths, the Slade, Camberwell College of Art, Middlesex University, Wimbledon College of Arts, Ulster University, De Montfort, and the University of Brighton. She's also held posts at Northumbria, the University of Gloucestershire, and at Central St Martin's, and she currently holds the post of tutor in painting at the Royal College of Art School of Arts and Humanities. In March 2020, the reason why we're all here this evening, Emma was awarded the 8th Max Mara Prize for Women in collaboration with Whitechapel Gallery London and Fondazione Maramotti in Italy. And this award has included 6 months in Italy, spending time between Reggio Emilia, Catania, and Rome, and will culminate in Emma's solo show at Whitechapel Gallery in London in 2022. Emma has previously exhibited at DCA Dundee, East Side Projects, Birmingham, Arcadia Missa in New York, KM21 The Hague, Turner Contemporary in Margate, Drawing Room London, the Freud Museum, Neuer Aachener Kunstverein in Aachen, Tates and Ives, Kunsthaus Centre der Pasquart, Biel, Switzerland. And she has forthcoming exhibitions at the Kunsthalle Gießen in Germany and the Whitechapel Gallery in London and Collezione Maramotti in Italy, as I mentioned. In her work, Emma crosses media, embracing drawing alongside painting, animation, textile, sculpture, and also incorporating text in a really specific and carefully crafted script. She confronts some fundamental existential problems, social injustice, climate change, using an autobiographical and very personal lens to access political themes. and presenting us, and I think we're going to hear about that tonight, with new kinds of protagonism, new kinds of actors in our possible futures that might be rather unexpected. Valentino Nizzo did his training in the field of Etruscology after a 2-year postdoctorate in global archaeology at the Italian Institute of Human Sciences in Florence. In 2010, he became archaeologist at the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, first at the National Archaeological Museum in Ferrara, and then at the General Directorate for Museums. And in 2017, he won the international selection for the direction of the National Etruscan Museum of Villa Giulia, our close neighbour here in Rome. Valentino also teaches widely for archaeology programs at a number of Italian universities, including Udine, La Sapienza in Rome, and Bologna universities. He has a huge portfolio of over 200 publications, 4 monographs, and his research interests focus on the historical and material culture, issues of the Etruscan Italic civilizations, the first Greek colonization, the comparison between archaeology and anthropology, funerary ideology, and the mechanisms of archaeological communication. So, a very august panel, a high profile conversation. I want to warmly welcome our 2 speakers, and Emma is going to begin by telling us something about the work that she's been doing for this particular project. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to describe a bit the kind of work that I make for those of you that aren't familiar with my work. So to give examples, these are examples of previous works in DCA Dundee, in Pascal, in Switzerland, in The Hague, and Pascal again. So you can see that I'm predominantly making immediately imagery, which is kind of invented imagery, and I'm painting on silk, making very large-scale paintings quite often so that I can combine imagery, which is figurative, with pattern, with text, with different kinds of devices for telling narratives. And this is what's really important to me, is to figure out how to unpack narrative through making art. So the work is very hands-on, handmade, very sort of materially concerned. But I'm also trying to think about ways that help me articulate a number of things all at once, so there isn't only one focus in each piece of work. And I also make animation. These are some images from a project that I did for Circa in London. This is the very big screen at Piccadilly Circus, which this year in March I was lucky enough to be able to show a series of 4 animations every evening. On a kind of rolling program, every evening one of the animations was shown throughout the month of March. And it was really interesting for me to make a piece of work which responded to a public space. But again, the animations are made from drawings, very handmade drawings. And I'm going to show you a short animation so that you get a sense of the work that I've done, but also the kinds of works I'm thinking about for the shows that are coming up. Okay, well, hopefully, as you might have gathered, that didn't work properly. What you saw was a lot of jumps in the animation is a very smooth animation of someone moving around and walking around and moving around a city, and what you saw was some kind of strange jumping set of images. But anyway, apparently that's to do with the formatting of PC and Mac, so apologies for that. But hopefully you got a sense of the way that animation, for me, it's a very new part of my practice. I only started making animation in lockdown, but animation for me is a really interesting way of expanding a kind of narrative idea, but also using, concentrating on a very sort of material image making. And why I'm interested in this type of image making is that I'm very interested in the way things are told, the way that emotional, subjective ideas are then cast into much wider contexts, which mean that, you know, they through the work I'm trying to demonstrate how our understanding of the world comes from a very subjective moment, but we're also always part of the sort of structures that keep us in our place in the world, that keep things in the way they are in the world. And for the Max Mara Art Prize for the project, my starting point was this painting, which is by Gustav Klimt, which is called 3 Ages of Woman. And it's in the Gallery Nazionale d'Arte Moderne next door. And I was fascinated and repulsed simultaneously by this image, in particular the image of the elderly woman, because I see this woman standing in a state of shame with her head in her hands, and the idea of the image of the elderly woman naked being a sort of shameful image, something that we're not used to seeing, something that isn't celebrated, felt like something I wanted to respond to. But also, it's an interesting painting to me because it was acquired by the gallery to celebrate 50 years of the unification of Italy, which is a very, for me, strange painting to celebrate the unification of a nation. And when I was trying to understand how this represents an idea of nation, I started to think or look through the lens of thinking that the young woman and the baby represent a kind of modernist idea of a future space for a nation, and that the elderly woman represents ideas of old practices, of old methods, old ways of living. And I thought that's kind of interesting because at the moment we're relearning old practices in order to build sustainable futures. So I decided that I would take the elderly woman as a protagonist in a narrative, and I would make her into the person with the most agency, the person who could do the most. And so I thought that she would be someone who I could build a narrative where she would go into the future after some imagined disastrous event. She would go into the future and she would build a sustainable way of living. And then I thought, well, if she's going to do that, she could also go into the past. And if she went into the past, she could go to the foundations of governance, of hierarchical power structures, and she could rethink those so that she would be someone with the utmost agency who could reorder the ways that things operate and the way that power is structured. So in previous kind of moments of the residency, I spent some time on a permaculture site on Mount Etna. And while I was there, I was learning the principles of permaculture in order to be able to understand the practices that this elderly woman might be involved with in the future, this perceived future. But also what was interesting to me was that the principles of permaculture don't just apply to the way that plants might be grown, the way that the terrain might be treated, and the way that we deal with nature. They're also quite broad principles which describe ways of living amongst others the ways of sharing, ways of thinking, ways of approaching problems. And interestingly for me, there are 12 principles of permaculture. And I thought this is very interesting because I wanted the elderly woman, when she went to the past to rethink power structures, to re-perform the 12 Trials of Hercules. And in re-performing the 12 Trials of Hercules, I imagined that instead of the way that Hercules resolved these trials by killing, capture, colonization, theft, and aggressive acts, I imagined that she would consider these trials in a very different way and might use principles of commensalism, mutualism, and the principles of permaculture. So this is some examples of things that I was doing, like doing a composting course and finding out about the terrain in it. And also another part of the residency has been research into material for my own practice. So I've been learning knitting on knitting machines for the surfaces for my three-dimensional work. And also I've been researching sustainable materials for my own practice because I thought I can't think about a narrative which really is concerned with sustainability and not apply that to my own studio practice. So you see images of me finding out in Prato, outside of Florence, for example, finding out about the process of recycling fabric, or tests of making knitted surfaces, working with digital knitting machines, and also developing fabrics like recycled silk, and trying to make different kinds of surfaces that I need for the 3D things that I'm making. And also another part of that research has been that I've been lucky enough to visit archives in Italy, for example, the Archivio di Sorelle Fontana, which is here in Rome, where I've been able to see how artists have collaborated with designers to make unique fashion, which is when artists painted on clothing, and it was something that was a part of the development of Italian fashion in the mid-20th century that I was very interested in also looking at, because I always paint on film. So in Sicily I was also looking at ruins, because I was thinking about the narrative of the woman in the future walking through a very volatile environment, walking through a landscape where structures, like the structures that we live within, have broken down, and what it would be like for her to be walking through the ruins of our systems of power. So this is like evidence of different kinds of sites that I went to, and I just want to point out that there are ancient sites here, but there's also the site where there was an earthquake in Sicily, in Gibellina, and this piece of work is a response to the destruction of these very small towns all around Gibellina by Burri. It's a very famous piece of work where he filled the whole of the space of the town so that you get a sense of the streets, but the material of the town is made into a kind of memorial site. It's a really, really interesting artwork. I was just thinking about how it is that structures of civilization can be totally broken down and how we're always on an edge of destruction. And I'm just showing you these very briefly because I wanted to give you a sort of fill-in of the kinds of things I've been interested in. I'm very interested in looking at the ways that image and text and narrative have functioned previously in order to think about what painting or artworks that I make, how they can function, how they can operate. So here are examples of things that I've looked at which have been fascinating to me in terms of how you tell narrative, how you convey story, but also how you convey something which is about something that belongs in the moment of its making. So it's important to me that my work is about now, even though it projects into ideas of the future and the past. This is also a starting point for my project when I was thinking about the elderly woman performing the Trials of Hercules. Palazzo Madama is the Senate building, and above the building is the skin of the Nemean lion, which is the first trial that Hercules performed, where he killed the Nemean lion and then he skinned it, and he used the skin as his armor. And this is one of the ways that we can recognize images of Hercules. But also, it was intriguing for me that this symbol of power sits above a Senate building doorway, and that contemporaneously we hear now these kinds of rhetorics of classics, the classics being allied to governmental actions in Britain. We hear this a lot. In fact, Boris Johnson talked about Brexit as a Herculean task. We have this reminder quite often of the classics as the basis of power, which is, again, why I wanted to choose something like the Trials of Hercules. And then also I wanted to show that Gustav Klimt looked at Etruscan pottery, and these images of Greek and Etruscan versions of kind of telling about myths were really influential in his work. So just to give you an idea that when I think about how this elderly woman might resolve some of these trials, taking as an example the first trial of the Nemean lion, I thought that instead of killing and skinning the lion, the elderly woman might have an understanding where she could share an understanding with the lion that they both had experienced their exterior being used by a hierarchical system to increase the power of the hierarchical system. So there's a kind of moment of recognition between the woman, the sort of history of the woman, the body of the woman being used to increase a kind of potency in a Western structure of power and governance that is shared with the Nemean lion, whose skin is used as a kind of protective armor, but also as a symbol of power. So that's to demonstrate the ways that the 12 trials for me are like thought experiments where I can really examine how power functions and how power is used. These are just some images from the studio here, just to show you that the way I think through my ideas is through drawing predominantly. And here are some more examples of drawings where I'm looking at imagery like Hydra, the boar, the hind. These are different trials of Hercules that I've been thinking through and trying to figure out how I can reimagine and reinvent those as a kind of way of atomizing power. And just to show you, before I hand over to Valentino, that my sense of wanting to use imagery from the Etruscan images that I saw on vases previous to meeting Valentino was really a drive that I had, a real attraction to this type of graphic imagery, which is an imagery which manages to transport knowledge, transport information about the myths from one place to another. And this kind of movement of images was really fascinating to me, but also visually, I find the kind of quality of the graphic images really attractive and interesting, and something I wanted to look at much further. Okay, we're going to help each other with this. Okay, we've been to a lot of places together, and one of the places that I was really intrigued by is the Museo delle Navi di Nemi, which is where enormous ships were found in the lake at Nemi, and they were the lake was what do you call that?
Drained.
Dredged, drained. And the boats were then saved, moved to a museum that was specially built for them. But the sort of part of this incredible operation, which was again compared to a Herculean task by Mussolini, was that the boats were described as Mussolini's boats. So there's this kind of transference between the power of the ancient and the Roman Empire and, you know, ancient history of this region, and the way that that power can be transformed into a kind of usage in, say, the contemporary times of the Second World War. But it just is a demonstration of how this power kind of moves through time. But also the boats were burnt, which is the reason why is contested, right? Because originally it was thought that they were burnt by the Nazis, by the fascists, at the end of the war when they were losing the war. But in fact the story is
Un po' più complicata.
a bit more complicated, something a bit
Lo abbiamo
different.
scoperto da pochi anni che forse c'è una storia diversa nella distruzione delle navi. Il motivo per cui eravamo andati a Nemi era un altro, era quello di vedere un luogo del mito, quello di Diana.
So Valentino says that why the boats were built is an open question which is still being debated, but they went to Nemi in order to explore another mythological path, that of Diana.
Quello legato al ramo d'oro, alla ricostruzione antropologica intorno ai rituali del potere compiuta da James Fraser tra la fine dell'Ottocento e gli inizi del Novecento.
So between the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, exploring the construction of a new mythology around...
also through anthropology,
yes.
to understand the power, how does it work?
Yes, so sorry, I lost your train halfway through. So the transfer of power narratives through these kinds of stories.
E Emma però è stata colpita dalla storia delle barche, come vi ha spiegato, dal loro incredibile recupero dall'acqua, una vera e propria impresa italiana che solo il fascismo poteva raggiungere.
So Emma was very struck by the story of rescuing these boats from the bottom of the lake through an enormous undertaking that was really a kind of manifestation of fascist power in action.
Prosciugare un lago come solo era che ne avrebbe potuto, ma quello che l'ha colpita è poi la distruzione
The destruction of the natural...
delle navi. Da parte si pensava dei nazisti, ma in realtà sembra siano stati i partigiani, quindi gli italiani, che credevano che quelle navi fossero di Mussolini.
Okay, so the story of the destruction of the boats, which was originally thought to be something the fascists did at the end of the war, but then in fact it looks like was carried out by the partisans because they thought these were Mussolini's boats, so they were destroying Mussolini's power.
E questo è interessante perché rivela un aspetto anche di un'interpretazione sbagliata del passato e del potere che dal passato emerge e deriva.
So it's a very nice kind of microcosm of how the past can be misinterpreted and then that misinterpretation acted upon or handed down. Yeah.
Quindi, come spesso accade, si va per cercare una cosa e se ne trova un'altra.
So you go looking for one thing, as happens with research, and you find something completely different.
E c'è Onfale che ti ha colpito moltissimo e che rivedremo insomma alla fine del racconto più archeologico, però...
So this is Omphale that Emma was very struck by in particular on your journey.
E questa è un'immagine di una splendida scultura conservata nel Museo Gregoriano Profano dei Vaticani.
So a splendid sculpture in the Vatican Museums in the Gregorian collection, Gregorian.
Profan.
Yeah, I don't know.
Profano. I think it's the same. Ed è proprio quello che lei cercava, cioè una donna vestita dei panni di Eracle.
So this is just exactly what Emma was hoping to find. So this is a woman wearing Hercules symbols, items.
E sono proprio gli oggetti di Eracle, e la sua pelle del leone di Nemea e la sua clava.
So holding Hercules' club, wearing the lion skin.
Perché lei, che aveva assunto come schiavo Eracle,
So she has taken Hercules as her slave.
scopre che si trattava di un eroe e lo vuole come compagno, come amante.
So she discovers that in fact he's a hero and she wants him to become her lover. This is on file, yeah.
E questo fa sì che lei diventa Eracle, ma Eracle diventa una donna che fila la lana.
Okay, so she becomes Hercules and Hercules becomes a woman who spins.
E questo è uno dei passaggi straordinari del mito di Eracle, in cui c'è un'inversione che non è molto famosa, ma è esattamente quello che Emma voleva cercare.
So this is one of the ways in which Hercules myth kind of morphs through time in unexpected ways, and was exactly the kind of new protagonism that Emma was looking for.
E qui siamo io e lei all'inizio del nostro percorso, che è iniziato a Villa Giulia.
So there they are at the very beginning of their collaborative journey at the Villa Giulia.
Devo dire che sono grato agli Etruschi per avermi dato questa opportunità di conoscere Emma.
So Valentino is very grateful to the Etruscans who provided this opportunity to collaborate with Emma.
Perché è un'esperienza unica quella di entrare nella mente di un artista.
It's a very unique experience to be able to see from the point of view of an artist, to enter into her frame of mind.
Che attraverso di me ha voluto completare un suo percorso di conoscenza e di esplorazione.
So Emma, with Valentino's help, was going on this journey of discovery.
Abbiamo avuto diverso aiuto lungo il percorso. Questo è Maurizio Sannibale, responsabile della collezione etrusca dei Vaticani.
So this is the director of the Etruscan collections at the Vatican, Maurizio
Sannibale,
who so they had various collaborators, additional collaborators on their journey.
Che ci ha portati sul tetto dei Vaticani, in luoghi inaccessibili, e questa è Claudia Valeri, che ci ha aperto alcune sale chiuse solitamente al pubblico.
So they were able to explore parts of the Vatican collections that aren't usually accessible, up on the roof, in closed parts of the building.
Quando siamo insieme sorridiamo di più.
So they always smile when they're together.
Due parole su alcuni punti di lettura del mito di Eracle. Cioè, ho cercato di costruire per Emma un percorso che teneva conto delle coordinate dello spazio e del tempo.
So he tried to construct for Emma a narrative journey that took account of the two themes of space and time.
Mentre eravamo insieme provavo a parlarle in inglese e mi sembra che abbia capito molto.
So he tried to express himself in English during their collaboration, and it seemed to work.
Ma non ho voluto farvi provare la stessa esperienza questa sera.
He didn't want to impose the same experience on you this evening, hence my rather poor interventions.
Per le coordinate dello spazio è molto importante l'impresa dei buoi di Gerione.
So when we're talking about the question of space, then the Gerian bull is a very important starting point.
Che ha portato Eracle verso l'estremo occidente a combattere con un mostro dai 3 corpi.
So Heracles had to take on a monstrous creature with 3 bodies.
Per rubargli delle mandrie che ha dovuto poi portare con sé fino alla Grecia.
In order to steal its horns, is that right? And then take them.
Beards, the correct terms. Beard? Mandrie.
I've got the translation here somewhere. Mandrie.
Herds.
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 And taken back to Greece.
Yes.
Yes.
E nel riportarle in Grecia è passato attraverso l'Italia e ha avuto una tappa importante proprio a Roma.
So in taking these herds back to Greece, he passed through Italy and paused for an important sojourn in Rome.
E da questo passaggio da Roma, che era un luogo dove le mandrie transitavano dal centro dell'Italia per andare verso le valli fluviali,
So Rome was the place through which these herds were brought when they were moving from the highlands to the lowlands and back again.
quindi il mito di Eracle si unisce alla realtà locale.
So there's a meeting point between Herculean myth and the reality on the ground of the movement of cattle and
E
livestock.
aiuta anche noi a capire il perché Roma è diventata grande e potente.
So this helps us to understand why Rome became the important place that it did.
Per motivi economici che rendevano necessario quel passaggio.
Because there were economic motivations for that movement.
Anche perché una delle materie più preziose era il sale.
So salt was one of the most precious goods.
C'erano delle saline dove oggi è Roma e delle saline ancora più importanti erano dove oggi è Fiumicino.
So there were salt works in what is now Rome and also at Fiumicino.
E lungo la via Salaria questo sale poteva raggiungere il centro dell'Italia.
So salt was taken along the Salt Road, the Via Salaria, right through to the center of Italy.
E per questo motivo il culto di Eracle, che diventa la metafora di chi trasporta le mandrie, viene diffuso anche nel centro Italia.
Okay, so this was the way in which the Hercules myth, which was connected with the movement of livestock, was carried along salt routes into the rest of the center of Italy.
E nel foro boario, questa foto ci ritrae vicino all'arco di Giano, vi era il luogo di culto più antico e più famoso di Eracle, l'Ara Massima.
So in the Forum Boarium, I think it's called, is the point in Rome which had the oldest, most ancient cult of Hercules, the cult of the Ara Massima, the great altar of unconquered Hercules.
E questo spiega attraverso il mito l'importanza di questo eroe anche per il mondo etrusco e italico.
So this helps us to start to home in on why this myth was so important also in the Etruscan world and in wider Italian culture.
Capire attraverso la conoscenza dei luoghi come i miti si diffondono è stato un elemento importante nel percorso di Emma per capire anche come i simboli che i miti trasportano con sé possono essere utilizzati dagli uomini.
So understanding the routes that myths took in embedding themselves in culture is also a way of gaining access to how the symbols connected to those myths also spread.
E non va mai separato quindi un mito dai luoghi ai quali è collegato.
So you have to always place the myth back in its context, in its places to understand it.
Questo è un giovane Eracle, siamo nel Museo di Villa Giulia, che secondo uno dei miti accoglie la dea dell'aurora, la Mater Matuta, o alla foce del Tevere o presso il porto al centro di Roma o, secondo altre leggende, a Pirgi.
Okay, so this is a young Hercules in the Etruscan Museum who saves
yes,
from
the sea.
the sea the Mater Matuta, so the sort of
The
dawn
goddess
goddess
of the morning.
of the morning, yeah, the dawn.
Che era costretta al fuggire verso occidente perché aveva aiutato il giovane
So
Dioniso.
she was in flight and Hercules saved her at the mouth of the Tiber.
Esatto. E Eracle si configura come l'eroe civilizzatore, per questo la sua iconografia, la sua immagine la ritroviamo anche in un dio legato ai boschi silvani.
So Hercules is a civilizing hero, and he's often associated with the sylvan god, with the god of uncultivated places of the woods.
E questi aspetti ricorrono in tutti i miti legati ad Eracle, non solo quelli più famosi che lo hanno reso celebre, come le 12 fatiche.
So there are lots of myths associated with Hercules where we see this, not just the most famous ones that are associated with his 12 labors.
E nel nostro percorso la linea del tempo che abbiamo provato a seguire ha portato Emma a vedere come nel mondo classico il mito di Eracle si è evoluto nel tempo.
So one of the things that they were tracing in their journey was looking at how the myth of Hercules evolved and changed and morphed over time.
Le 12 fatiche in realtà sono state definite in un momento relativamente recente, intorno al 600 a.C. da Pisandro di Rodi.
So this moment, 600 before Christ, was the moment when these 12 labors of Hercules were sort of condensed as the center of his myth by text by Pisandro di Rodi, and that's relatively recent in Hercules mythology.
Che scrisse un poema Eracleia che è andato completamente perso.
So that he wrote a poem, Pisandro, called Heraclea, about the myth of Hercules, but we've lost the poem.
Era di Rodi, un'isola che faceva da ponte fra l'Oriente e l'Occidente.
So Pisandro was from Rhodes, and Rhodes is the kind of meeting point between East and West.
E questo gli ha consentito di guardare all'Oriente per riprendere dall'immaginario orientale molti aspetti che sono diventati quelli canonici del mito di Eracle.
So he was looking towards the east and was able to take influences from that direction that Rhodes points in and bring them back into the mythology of Hercules that we find here in the west.
E così Eracle è diventato quello che noi conosciamo nel mondo greco e nel mondo etrusco, che lo ha conosciuto proprio in questo periodo.
So this is how that we come to know Hercules in the Greek world, but also in the Etruscan world through this interpretation.
Ha cominciato quindi ad essere anche manipolato, come hanno fatto nell'Atene di Pisistrato.
So the myth started to be changed and manipulated. We find that in Athens.
O Pisistratus,
Pisistratus, the tyrant, that's right.
Come ha dimostrato un bellissimo studio del 75 di John Borman, di Sir John Borman, il maggior studioso del mito e dell'immagine di Eracle.
So this study by John Boardman is one of the ways that this has been discovered and laid down.
Modelli orientali sono molti, questi sono i rilievi assiri che mostrano immagini facilmente riconducibili a quello che è l'immaginario comune di Eracle.
So here we see some sort of Eastern examples of imagery from Syrian imagery that clearly shows Herculean qualities.
Il discorso è molto più complesso, ma lo sintetizzo come vi ho detto.
It's all much more complicated than this, but Valentino is synthesizing for us.
Nel mondo etrusco dell'VIII secolo si passa da un immaginario geometrico e astratto con divinità che non hanno l'aspetto antropomorfo.
So in the Etruscan world of the 800 BC, I think.
Yes, of the Iron Age.
Yeah, so of the early Iron Age, you find a transition from a non-anthropomorphic imagery
of the goddess.
Yes, towards
ad una celebrazione del sole, degli astri, e quando si incontrano i greci questo immaginario viene lasciato, ricodificato e reinterpretato e comincia ad accogliere il mito.
So towards a symbolism that is clearly moving more towards familiar imagery and also embracing this myth.
Come mostra questo vaso come una delle prime raffigurazioni degli Argonauti.
So this is one of the earliest depictions of the Argonauts.
Gli Etruschi quindi hanno la capacità di recepire in modo molto precoce i miti greci.
So the Etruscans are very early, receiving, open to this Greek mythology.
Li adattano al loro immaginario
And then they adapt it to their own imagery.
e riescono insieme poi ai Romani a fargli attraversare il tempo mantenendoli simili al modello originario.
So they take it down through time, as the Romans also did, retaining some key characteristics, retaining its core.
Questa immagine mostra un esempio di forza della tradizione,
So this is showing you the power of tradition,
uno scudo simbolico
symbolic shield
da una tomba del 730 a.C.
from a tomb from 730 before Christ,
che diventa un simbolo religioso
becoming a religious symbol,
e verrà conservato immutato fino alla fine dell'impero romano.
and then remaining unchanged until the end of the Roman Empire.
Grazie alla ripetizione e alla riproposizione delle immagini.
Because of the repetition of images through time.
È come se si creassero due strade parallele nel mondo classico.
It's as if in the classical world you have two parallel paths, trajectories.
In quello greco l'immagine e il mito continua ad essere elaborato, ad accrescersi e a mutare.
So in the Greek world, the myth continues to be elaborated, to grow, to change.
In quello etrusco si mantiene più simile all'originale e così anche in parte in quello romano.
So in the Etruscan world, the myth is stabilized and ceases to change, and then also that is taken on by the Roman world.
I vasi che stiamo vedendo sono vasi greci,
These are Greek vases,
importati in Etruria,
imported into Etruria
siamo nel VI secolo,
in the 6th
e
century.
queste sono tutte immagini che mostrano Eracle insieme alla donna che lo ha reso un eroe, ha aiutato a renderlo un
So this
eroe.
is Hercules together with the woman who made him into a hero, who
Athena.
helped Athena.
E questo ci ricorda quanto una donna sia importante nella riuscita di un uomo anche se è un eroe.
So this places a woman back at the center of the myth as the person who helped the hero to become the hero.
Questa immagine è molto importante per capire tanti aspetti che interessano ad Emma.
So this is an image that helps us to get to the heart of what was motivating Emma, interesting Emma.
Perché Eracle diventa un modello per il potere politico,
Because Hercules becomes a model for political power.
perché attraverso le sue imprese, la sua opera di civilizzazione,
So through his undertakings and his civilizing work,
si guadagna un posto tra gli dei,
he manages to make himself a god. He earns the status of a god.
raggiungendo dopo la morte l'immortalità
So he achieves immortality after death
e la giovinezza eterna.
and eternal youth.
E questa immagine raffigura Atena che lo porta trionfante dopo la morte nell'Olimpo.
So this is Athena taking Hercules after death triumphant to Olympus.
Così è raffigurato in sculture. Questa opera a Villa Giulia forse ha anche il nome dell'artista che l'ha realizzata, Vulca.
So this is a work from the Villa Giulia that has the name of Vulca, the artist who made it, so the Etruscan artist who's known by name.
Lui così, esatto. E in queste altre immagini si vede Eracle insieme ad Atena che lo sta per portare sull'Olimpo.
And so there's more images of Athena raising Hercules in her chariot towards Olympus.
Questo modello viene ripreso da tutti i tiranni, gli uomini di potere e i re del VI secolo.
So this was a very important imagery for tyrants and rulers in this period.
Che ambiscono alle stesse imprese di Eracle, diventare immortali ed eterni.
Because they were also aiming for immortality and eternal youth.
Dopo il VI secolo l'immagine di Eracle perde quella forte connotazione politica.
After the 6th century, that strong political influence is lost in the mythology.
E si trovano altri aspetti del suo mito sulla ceramica e su tante altre opere.
So other aspects of his myth can be found in ceramics and other kinds of works.
Questa è la prova, una delle tante, del culto di Eracle in Etruria, la celebre Chilix di Eufronios con scritto Hercules.
So this is a sign of Hercules myth in Etruria. It says Hercules on the base of the
delle iscrizioni.
Sì.
E questa è l'unica diciamo, impresa in cui Eracle poteva rischiare di rimanere sconfitto, quella contro la vecchiaia.
So this is the only task that Hercules threatened to lose, which was his attempt to overcome old age.
Le ultime immagini ci mostrano il modo in cui Eracle era venerato anche nelle regioni interne della penisola.
So these are images that show the worship of Hercules in the interior of the country.
L'eroe è molto stilizzato, si vede la clava, si vede la
A
leontè.
very stylized hero with his club and his lion skin.
La sua immagine ricorre su tutti i tipi di supporti, frequente sugli specchi Eracle contro Ippolita, contro l'Amazzone.
So lots of different places where he's depicted. This is on mirrors, you said?
Yes,
Hercules against, who's that?
su questo abbiamo riflettuto molto con Emma, i mostri, le imprese in cui si confronta Eracle sono contro tutto quello che va in un terreno che è lontano dalla civiltà o dall'idea di civiltà.
Okay, so Hercules is combating things far from civilization, or things that go against civilization.
E anche una donna che combatte nell'immaginario dei greci e degli etruschi era qualcosa che era incivile.
So seeing a woman fighting was already an uncivilized thing. This is the Amazons.
E le immagini ritraggono anche Eracle in riposo.
So this is Hercules at rest.
Quello il famoso pugilatore non è Eracle, ma l'iconografia ricorda quella di
So this is
Eracle.
not Hercules, but you can see how it was influenced.
E nel mondo romano continuano le raffigurazioni dei miti e delle imprese.
So continuing imagery through the Roman world.
Il potere di Eracle viene più volte evocato dagli imperatori.
So an imperial borrowing of this potency of the figure of Hercules.
O anche da persone comuni che su sarcofagi si fanno raffigurare con il volto di Eracle intento in una delle imprese.
So on sarcophaguses where you find Hercules undertaking one of his heroic tasks.
Tutti quanti vorremmo essere Eracle e avere il suo premio, ma quanto è costato ad Eracle riceverlo?
We all want to be like Hercules, but how much did it cost him?
E siamo tornati ad Onfale,
And
quindi
here
passo
we come back to the women on Friday. Yeah.
la parola a Emma.
Really spontaneous.
It's just a really good demonstration of the kind of level of input that I've received over the time that I've been spending time with Valentino, because for me it's been an incredible experience of being able to understand the context for my idea in such depth, and to understand the sort of the history is not only the history but also the imagery that goes with that history. It's been incredible. Thank you.
Well, so thank you both very much for inputting and giving us an idea of the conversation that you've been having, which I must apologise for my simultaneous translation. I'm not trained, but I hope that the much more beautifully phrased contribution that Valentino was making was clear to those of you who didn't follow the Italian. I think at this stage we might want to open the discussion and take questions from anybody in the audience who would like to ask, follow on, pick up on, or ask our speakers to develop anything that we've heard this evening. Slightly aware of the time, so we've used our hour presenting to you, but it would be excellent to hear from the audience at this stage. And I think we have a roving microphone so that we can hear you. If anybody would like to jump in. Yes, in the front row.
Vorrei aggiungere che c'è una figura che fa da ponte tra Emma e tutto il racconto così interessante che ci ha fatto Valentino, no? Ed è nello stesso museo dove Emma ha visto le 3 età della donna, ed è quell'opera fantastica di Antonio Canova, Ercole e Nesso. E non è un caso perché per Canova il mito dell'immortalità, no? Il fascino del mondo greco e del mondo romano era la materia prima della sua grande fascinazione. Quindi io non salterei questo momento cruciale della connessione tra questi due mondi. Cioè Canova, come neoclassico, in realtà apre in questo caso a un'idea di contemporaneità. E poi c'è, invece adesso questo è uno statement, poi c'è una domanda.
I'll just quickly translate the statement.
Okay.
So just pointing out that there's another beautiful work next door to us in the Galleria Nazionale di Arte Moderna by Canova, which is, I didn't catch the title, Hercules.
Ercole e Nesso.
And
Nesso. E c'è
so
anche,
it acts as a bridge between the myth of Hercules and
e c'è anche la pelle comunque del leone che compare come il suo simbolo, il suo statement. Ma poi c'è così una domanda, invece questo era così un nesso professionale, invece poi c'è una domanda un po' banale che vorrei fare a lei come direttrice o a chi può rispondere. Non ero al corrente di questa magnifica iniziativa che fa Max Maramotti, che sia il nostro sarto preferito o il sarto preferito di alcune donne che amano molto lo stile classico, e questa è una cosa che tutte possiamo apprezzare, no, di Max Mara. Ma mi interesserebbe sapere qualcosa di più di com'è questo premio, com'è avvenuta questa connessione, qual è stata l'esperienza personale sua in questo contesto, e quali sono, questo può essere forse una curiosità che ci viene. Grazie mille.
Questo premio is a prize for women, which is based on a selection by a panel. So a panel in London of different people from the art world select a number of artists that they've seen their work during the previous year or 2 years. And then they invite 5 selected artists to make a proposal to develop a project, a proposal for a project they might like to develop if they win the prize. And then after the artists have made their presentations, then they select one person. But it's important, I think, to say that the Collezione Maramotti is the art collection of Max Mara. And therefore, this is the relationship, that there's an interest in contemporary art, in supporting contemporary artists. And the prize is really aimed at offering a woman artist an opportunity to really concentrate on their work, to develop their work, but also to make a connection with Italy, which is a really sort of wonderful opportunity, very well supported opportunity to be able to experience a period of time in Italy and be able to work with specialists and to really sort of investigate the project that you've proposed, but every time it's a completely different project. So every time it connects to completely different places in Italy.
We have the director just behind you. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
One maybe add that prize was born from a collaboration between Max Mara and the Whitechapel Gallery back in 2005. So Emma is the winner of the 8th edition. And the collection entered the prize when it opened to the public in 2007, so taking care especially of the residency, the Italian residency, because it's an institution dedicated to art and based in Italy, so it's the best player to make network and support the artist and stay in dialogue with the artists. So the prize is especially, started with the desire to support the work of the women artists, because Max Mara is, of course, a fashion company dedicated to women, and the Whitechapel Gallery is one of the main institutions for modern and contemporary art, and especially in the decades, a pioneer institution for recognize and acknowledge the work of the women artists. So that was the combination.
And it's worth adding, perhaps in relation to that, you said in your proposal as well that this was, you sort of embody why it's so important to have a prize, I think, directed at women artists, because you arrive at a moment in your life when you're able to turn away from other kinds of responsibilities, in your own case, caring responsibilities, and actually this enables you to make space to do your other job, your actual job, your other job, which is so the idea of creating space to allow you to be the protagonist of your creative kind of journey is particularly important in your case, but one can see how that particularly applies to the woman artists.
It's an incredibly generous prize.
I have a question for Emma. It's just a curiosity, because it was fascinating to listen to Valentino Nizzo speaking about all this development and changing of also in the course during the time of these myths. And so I'm curious to know about what's the most radical thing that you thought you knew before studying and researching about the Etruscan culture in Rome with Valentino. Something that you were sure you already know, and that's kind of the basic story we knew and we know about Herculean myth, but in the end we already had some hints here, but I was curious to ask you what's the most surprising thing you discovered during this journey.
I think, almost deliberately I knew what the 12 trials were, but I didn't know very much about them, because when you research, that's when you fill in kind of knowledge, so I didn't know the way that the trials are actually collages, kinds of combinations of parts of history that are initiation rites, based on initiation rites or battles or different events that have taken place, that have maybe ritualistic meaning, that have historical import, but they're a sort of invention of the remembrance of all of those activities. And each one has a different focus. And I also didn't really think about or know about the fact that the trials take Hercules from being a young man to being an older man who can then become a god. This idea that they represent passages of time through life. They represent different kinds of developmental activities or events that kind of formulate the idea of someone's life experience. And I didn't know about Omphale, so this was a complete revelation, really recent to me, that was just like, I can't believe what I'm looking at after seeing many, many images of Hercules, and then sort of realizing there is actually this sort of swap around. And what else? So many things. I think the thing is really that, to have filled out the space of the understanding that I had, but also to be able to then use that as a way to kind of think through the ways that I could reinvent those tasks, if that makes sense.
Will your protagonist use force?
No,
Never.
I don't think she needs to. That's the point, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think reason. I think the other part of that's interesting about the trials is quite often Hercules doesn't know how to do something, doesn't know how to resolve something, and it's Athena who suggests, you could do this. Like with the Nemean lion, Hercules doesn't know how to skin the lion because the skin of the lion is so tough that it's, you can't damage it, you can't pierce the skin with arrows or whatever. And it's Athena that says, well, you take the claw of the lion and that will cut the skin. It's always like Athena who has advice that decides how some of the tasks might not the task be resolved, because quite often he resolves them just by brute force. But she comes up with very useful bits of advice, which is important.
Other questions or comments from the floor?
Una piccola domanda, è possibile sapere qualcosa di più sulla tecnica? Perché ha cominciato dicendo che lavora sulla seta, no?
Sì.
Ma da qui forse era un effetto tridimensionale delle slide, sembrava come se ci fosse un ricamo, qualcosa, uno spessore.
Sì.
E volevo capire come lo ottiene e qual è la procedura.
So, yeah, I paint on silk, and partly, that interests me because you can shape it, you can make it, situate it within a space in a way that responds to the space. You can really think about how something operates as a object or a sort of materiality within a space. So it doesn't operate like a rectangular painting on a stretcher. That was important to me. That it could be something that responded to any kind of space or any kind of subject. But also I painted material to make the surfaces for the three-dimensional pieces. And I always thought of the three-dimensional pieces as drawings in 3 dimensions. I didn't want to call them sculptures because I didn't want to attach them to a kind of history of maybe some of the images that we've been looking at. I didn't want them to be attached to a kind of much more sort of dominant history of kind of solid objecthood. I wanted them to be very much like an invented thing, like I would invent a drawing, an image in a drawing. So I always used materials that are very immediate. And I altered the materials by painting them, and I was sewing as if I would be drawing a shape and then filling those to make the form. So it's very kind of handmade and immediate. But the prize has allowed me to extend the quality of the way that I make the surfaces, so that now I'm using jacquard machine knitting to make pattern surfaces, or I'm working with a company that makes digital knitwear to develop more sort of physical surfaces out of wool. But it's always a very, sort of material, as in fabric, material kind of making. And the paper, when I'm making drawings, the paper is a type of cardi paper, so it's like very physical. It has bits of leaf in it. It's very, you can see it's making. So the technique of painting on silk is something that I've had to figure out. I've had to work out myself how to do it. But the one thing about it is that if you make a mark on the silk, you can't take it off. So you have to, everything you do is first time. It's got to be just like that, like you did it. And I really like that because it means that it's immediate, like making a drawing. And if I could change it, I think there would be more doubt.
Any other questions or comments?
I've got a question and a microphone, so power. I wanted to ask Valentino, you said that you saw through Emma's eyes or in her framework, and I wanted to know what that enabled you to see or think or interpret.
No, ha chiesto che tu hai detto all'inizio che vedevi attraverso la visione di Emma, che cosa hai visto di nuovo o di inaspettato?
Molte cose. Intanto ho dovuto ragionare su quello che le dovevo raccontare in base a ciò che le serviva.
So first I had to select what I was going to explain to her according to what her needs were.
Quindi ho dovuto scomporre quello che sapevo di Eracle e ricomporlo in base alla sua esigenza di ragionare e confrontarsi con il mito.
So I had to sort of undo what I knew about the myth of Hercules and then reconstruct it according to the kind of view of it and questions of it that Emma wanted to ask.
Cercando di utilizzare per il racconto quello che del mondo antico avevamo a disposizione in un raggio, in uno spazio ragionevole intorno a Roma e a Roma.
So also to construct a journey that allowed us to see things, the material culture that was in a kind of achievable and locatable panorama around Rome.
Ci sono delle cose che lei ha visitato da sola, quindi al di fuori di quello che era il percorso che ho potuto costruire.
So Emma went to see some things on her own as well, outside this program that you constructed for her.
E nel momento in cui ci siamo poi trovati a confrontarci sul tema sono emerse tante riflessioni.
So when we met across this theme together, lots of new ideas came out of that.
Perché la mia visione, uso un termine antropologico che però viene dall'inglese, è etica.
So my own view, using a term derived from Anglo-Saxon anthropology, is ethical.
E la sua è emica.
And hers is emical.
Nella mia prospettiva di studio le cose sono fatte, cioè si sono definite, nella sua sono ancora vive e lei è parte attiva in un processo che continua.
So in my view, from the view of the researcher, things are as they are, they're fixed, they're done. From Emma's view, they are alive, they're still in process and she's part of that process.
Io non cambierò mai l'immagine di Eracle, mi sforzerò di continuare a capirla. Lei, come artista, ha gli strumenti per continuare a cambiarla e continuare a farla vivere.
So from my point of view, the images are fixed, they're not changing anymore, whereas from Emma's point of view, she has that capacity to change and develop those images, that myth.
E per uno studioso, vedere dall'interno questo processo, ma anche condizionarlo, indirizzarlo, è straordinario e dà l'idea dell'importanza dei valori immateriali del nostro patrimonio.
Gosh, I've lost the end of that at the beginning. So from his point of view, as a researcher, andiamo.
So from this point of view, I could better understand the importance of the immaterial values of our past, of our heritage.
Avete visto?
Ciao. E davvero è una cosa molto bella, molto importante.
This is very beautiful and important.
Ed è forse uno degli aspetti sicuramente uno degli aspetti più produttivi di un lavoro che altrimenti si potrebbe pensare va solo nella direzione della conservazione.
So this is a really important corrective to the idea that the work we do only leads to conservation rather than creation. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the purpose of the British School at Rome, I should add, to bring these conversations and to allow those of us who have that closed vision to talk to those who create that open vision, which is so important to remind us of why we do what we do, not to close things, but to keep them open.
Open mind.
Yeah. I think that is a very productive and excellent note